So with marijuana testing, the H sub O is that the person uses marijuana, or at least they have it in their system. So on this side, we've got the truth of H sub O. That's the gosh darn truth. And over here is the decision you make. Okay. So you might decide to accept the null hypothesis, or you might decide to reject the null hypothesis. So if you accept the null hypothesis in this case, you're saying, yep, they use marijuana. And if you reject it, you're going to say, nope, they don't. We did some testing. We don't think they do. But then if you think about the truth of it, it could be that they really do use marijuana, or they really don't. Okay. So if your marijuana test, let's suppose that they really are a drug user, and then your marijuana test is a good test, and you say, I think they're a drug dealer. Well, or not drug dealer, drug user. And then that means that they're correct. That means that your tests show that they use marijuana, and they do. So your test is a good test. It was accurate. Or you could do a test and the truth is that they are not a drug user, and your test shows that they aren't a drug user. Again, your test was successful then. That's a good thing. However, what if they are a drug user, but you say they aren't? What that is, that's called a false negative. That means that they got away with it, essentially. This is something you don't want your test to do. You don't want your test to have a false negative. Or you could say, look, I think that they use marijuana, but in reality, they don't, and that's called a false positive. So which one's worse? A false negative means that you possibly could have a marijuana user working at your company. Probably not great for your company, but not a huge problem. It depends on your view. If your view is from the company's side, this is a problem. You don't want somebody who's a drug user working in your company. If you're the person who's getting tested, the false positive is the worst thing, because that means that you could be denied a job or refused a position because you tested positive even though you don't actually use drugs. So this is worse for the person being tested, and this is the worst for the company. Okay, so if we relate this to a hypothesis test, here again is the truth of H sub O. This is H sub O is true, and this is H sub O is false, and this is your decision. Okay, so you could accept H sub O, or you could reject H sub O. Again, if you accept H sub O, if you accept whatever the null hypothesis is and it's true, that's good. And if you reject the null hypothesis and it's truly false, that is good as well. This one is called a type 1 error. That was like that false negative we got in the last one. And this one's called a type 2 error. That's a false positive. So let's look at a pretty serious example, probably more serious than the one we just did. The USDA limit for salmonella contamination in chicken is 20%, which is true, by the way. A meat inspector reports that the chicken produced by a company exceeds the USDA limit. Okay, so let's quickly write down a null and an alternative hypothesis here. The null hypothesis says that they're claiming that the chicken exceeds the limit. Exceeds is greater than, so I'm going to put that over here, and it's a proportion. So P is greater than 20%, and that's the claim. And then over here we have that P is less than or equal to 20%, because that's the opposite. Okay, so type 1 and type 2 error. This is going to be the hardest part of the assignment, by the way, understanding what's a type 1 and what's a type 2 error, but that will be on the stats test for AP. Okay, so type 1. For this one, it's basically that you say that the null hypothesis is false. Which means this one's out, which means this one's in. So you say the company was greater than 0.2% when they actually were less than or equal to 20%. And type 1, or type 2, is that you say the company, this is when you believe the null hypothesis, but you shouldn't have. So you say the company was less than or equal to 20% when they actually were greater than 0.2. Okay, so which one's worse? If you say that the company is greater than 0.20 or 20% when they actually were less than or equal to 20%, what that means is you probably just shut down that business for a while. That's bad for the business. Type 2, you say that the company was less than or equal to 0.2. They were actually greater than 0.2, which is bad for everybody. That could kill people. So again, a type 2 error is a little bit more serious on this one. Salmonella and poisoning, kind of important. All right, you're probably thinking that these notes take forever, but the rest of these are just going to fly. The type 1 and type 2 errors is the stuff that slowed us down. So here we go. There are 3 types of tests. Let's see, we've got H sub O, H sub A. Okay, so the first one is, I'm just going to use mu on this one, or I guess I really don't need to use either. For the first one, the H sub O is greater than or equal to, and the H sub A is less than. For the second one, the H sub O is less than or equal to, and the H sub A is greater than. And the third one, H sub O is equal to, and the H sub A is not equal to. Those are the 3 options. So let's draw some bell curves, everybody's favorite thing. Whew, I'm out of practice. This is bad news. That one was a little better, I guess. These are all real ugly. Okay. So, this is the important thing that you can write down. The alternative, that's not how you spell alternative. Alternative hypothesis is always the tail. And that'll make sense as we start drawing it, but that's something words to live by. Alternative hypothesis is always the tail. So the alternative hypothesis here is less than. That means it's on the left. So over here is the alternative hypothesis. That's less than. And over here is the greater than or equal to null hypothesis. This is called a left-tailed test, as I'm sure you can understand why it is called that. Okay, this one, the tail is greater than, that's over here. H sub A is greater than on the right. H sub O is over here, less than or equal to. H sub O is always the bigger area. H sub A is always the smaller area. And I'm guessing that you can guess that this one's called a right-tailed test. This section's probably going to feel shaky for you. But the next 2 sections are going to make hypothesis testing a breeze, and so that should make it a lot easier. And then we're going to do a kind of project, which should be pretty fun, where you're going to ask people questions and test hypotheses of your own. Hypotheses. Okay, for this one, H sub O is equal to, and H sub A, which is on either side this time, is not equal to. It could be more, it could be less, it is not equal to. And this one is called a two-tailed test. All right, so last example of the day. It says